Why? Well, this leads us to question 2. Why don't we think much or make much of the ascension of Jesus Christ? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. And in his book called The Ascension of Christ, Patrick Schreiner, he lists 5 reasons that I think are somewhat helpful for us to think about when it comes to the ascension and why we don't think a whole lot about it. Number 1 is this: the Bible speaks just little of it. This is probably the one, if not the primary reason for people to overlook the ascension. The Bible doesn't say a whole lot about the actual event. In fact, the customary Greek word for ascent is not even used in the New Testament. And there's only 2 places in the New Testament that actually cover this event: Luke 24, Acts chapter 9. That means that there's only 7 verses in the Bible that actually cover this event, talk about Jesus ascending into heaven. And if you're wondering, that's 0.03% of all the verses in the Bible. No, I did not do the math. I just happened to look that up. But Matthew's gospel doesn't even talk about it. Neither does the original ending of Mark's gospel. There's an additional ending to Mark's gospel that came later. And at the end of John's gospel, Jesus is still on the earth. And then Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, where he describes what is of first importance, does not include the ascension of Christ. And so if it's such a key part of the story, then why do the other gospel writers not include it? Why is there so little space given to it in the gospels? Why is it never used, the word never used? Why does Paul not even consider it of first importance? And so the Bible, first, it speaks little of it. Second, the ascension seems like a bad plan. Let me ask you a question. What seems like a better plan to you? Jesus staying on earth or Jesus leaving? Well, if you're the disciples, it's like a no-brainer. Jesus staying on earth. They were shattered when Jesus died. They didn't know what to do. Jesus staying on earth seems like an intuitively better idea. And you can just see this with kind of these couple premises and conclusions. Think about it this way. Premise number 1, being with Jesus bodily in the new heavens and earth is the best end state. Premise number 2, Jesus is no longer with us in his body. Conclusion, it would have been better if he had not left. And you think about this just practically for a moment. Think about evangelism. Think about how much easier, or at least we assume easier it would be to evangelize, to tell people about Christ. Talking about somebody who is no longer here, who is gone, isn't always the easiest thing to sell, to communicate. But if Jesus were on earth, it might be easier to convince someone of the importance of Jesus. We live in a world that prizes, that values physical proof and evidence. People want tangible evidence for claims, not just assertions that are impossible or hard to prove. It'd be like, just go over here. Jesus is going to be here. Go see Jesus. We think evangelism would be so much easier if Jesus would stay. Or people might think it would be better if he were on earth because he could do a better job of comforting us, if Christ were physically beside us. When someone is physically beside you, comforting you, you feel better. Not just when you know someone is distant and away and they are sympathetic to you, but when they're right there with you. And if Jesus was there next to us going through our sorrows, wouldn't that feel so much better? And so there's many reasons where in our own mind we think this doesn't sound like the best idea. So second, the ascension seems like a bad plan. Third, the implications are unclear. My guess is if you were asked the question, what is the significance of the ascension, which we're going to ask here in a moment, my guess is that many would have a hard time succinctly answering that question. Be like, I'm not exactly sure. Some of you might answer that fine, but many would probably say, I'm not exactly sure what the implications are. And that would be the case because, at least to us, it's a bit blurry or unclear as to what it means. Wasn't the resurrection enough, we think? Does Jesus really need to ascend to heaven? In fact, before Jesus takes off to heaven, the disciples ask him in Acts 1, verse 6, Lord, are you restoring the kingdom to Israel at this time? Jesus died, and now he's back alive, and they still have this idea of who the Messiah is, that he's going to set up his kingdom now. He's going to rule and reign over Rome, that Israel will be put back in this place of power. And they ask this question, Lord, are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel at this time? See, they weren't expecting the ascension. They're thinking, isn't this the time now where you're going to set up your kingdom and conquer all those who are against us? And maybe that's why they're just kind of caught staring into the heavens when Jesus ascends and the angel appears and tells them to get to work for what they thought and hoped for was not as they imagined. Jesus, in their mind, was not supposed to leave according to their plan. And complicating even a bit more, there are only, again, 2 passages really recounting the ascension, and they contain very little theological explanation for the purpose of the ascent of Christ. And so I think, similar to the disciples, we can stand here just looking into heavens a bit confused as to what does the ascension mean. Now, the Bible does answer that question. It just doesn't answer that question in one place, in one passage, but throughout the Scripture, the New Testament. So third, implications are unclear. Fourth, the event is a bit abnormal. Just from a modern perspective, it's somewhat objectively strange. It may seem ridiculous to many. You think about it for a moment. You have this middle-aged man going up into the air. I don't know, maybe fast, maybe slow, maybe at a medium speed, just kind of disappearing into the clouds. And where did he go? With our modern scientific worldview, we know he must have traveled into the atmosphere, through the atmosphere, and then what? And how did he just survive without a spacesuit? I mean, nobody can go into space without a spacesuit. Like, how did he make it? Even if you accept supernatural healings or the resurrection from the dead, those miracles, to some degree, can make a little bit more sense because people can actually live their restored lives. They're healed, and now they're living this kind of, quote, normal life. And the disciples, though, they're just left kind of looking into the heavens, staring, not knowing what to do. Because this time Jesus didn't die, he just took off, he left. And though we like to think that we're different from the disciples, I think we can find ourselves just kind of staring up, thinking, wondering, what has happened? Why is this event necessary? It's somewhat abnormal. Fifth, the resurrection absorbs the ascension. It just absorbs the ascension. We focus on the resurrection over the ascension. Often Scripture just kind of conceptually combines these 2 events into one. That the ascension just gets included in the resurrection or the glorification of Jesus. That when we read about the exaltation, the glorification of Jesus, what happens is we just our minds just go to the resurrection and we just kind of skip over the ascension. And I get it when you look at how the New Testament authors write. When the New Testament authors write, they kind of slide seamlessly from Jesus' death to his glory. And the resurrection and ascension are just kind of both included in this glorification category. Let me give you some examples. For instance, in Luke 24, verse 26. Wasn't it necessary for the Messiah to suffer these things and enter into his glory? Luke's telling us how Jesus the Messiah would suffer and enter into his glory. He just moves quickly from the death of Jesus to the glorious state of Jesus. But in that glorious state of Jesus, what is encompassed is the resurrection and the ascension. Or Paul in Philippians 2, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And for this reason, God highly exalted him, giving him the name that is above every name. Paul pivots from the cross straight to Jesus' exaltation. And this exaltation encompasses the resurrection and the ascension in the minds of Paul. Or Peter. Peter spends time in Acts chapter 2 talking about how Jesus was raised up. Verse 24, verse 32. But when you look at Acts 2, 24 through 36, it's about this resurrection and the ascension. And sometimes it makes it hard to distinguish between these two. See, in the apostles' minds, kind of the upward movement of Jesus rising from the dead continued in the ascension. But when most readers, when we read these texts about the exaltation of Christ or the glory of Christ, we just think of the resurrection. And it's not wrong to think of the resurrection, it's just not complete. It's not complete. Because when the New Testament writers refer to the exaltation, they are thinking of the completed act of the resurrection and the ascension as a whole. It's grouped together. Put it this way, we can't equate the resurrection of Christ's full glorification. If the resurrection fully confirms Jesus' lordship, then the ascension becomes anticlimax. We can have the tendency to cut off what is implied in the apostles' presentation only to speak of the resurrection. We just talk about the resurrection, but the biblical authors, they viewed Christ's act of rising as incomplete until Christ ascended and sat on his throne. So to the New Testament writers and apostles, the ascension of Jesus matters. It matters, but why? Why does it matter?